right. Well, I just want to welcome everyone and thank you all for joining our annual webinar today. I'll start off by first acknowledging the privilege of hosting this virtual meeting on the unceded territories of the peoples whose land we are very grateful to be living, working, and playing on. My name is Swayam. I will be your co-host for today's webinar. I'm a volunteer member of the Citizens Advisory Committee. I've been volunteering with the committee for about 5 or 6 years now. I'm very happy to be joining you all today and very grateful to our presenters who will be sharing some very valuable information with everyone. I will just go over some housekeeping rules. So our webinar will be recorded. The link will be sent to everyone in about 1 week. Please do note that the video or your video will not be turned on. You are welcome to participate by submitting questions to the panelists in the chat or Q&A window or introducing yourselves to others. And we please kindly ask that everyone be respectful when you're posing questions and having discussions in the chat. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. If we cannot answer all of them, our panelists will try to provide written responses later. In the event the webinar is suddenly cut off, please wait a few moments for us to restart the webinar and then you can rejoin. If you are experiencing any audio-video problems, try using a personal device rather than a desktop or a laptop. Slides and resources will be made available to our attendees later on, likely once our webinar recording is posted. And I also wanted to note that for the first time in the 6 years of us hosting these webinars, we are pleased to provide ASL interpretation service. This is so if you are needing to enable that service, you can click on the interpretation option at the bottom of the screen. And you have the ability to resize the interpreter windows as needed as well. The interpretation windows will be recorded separately and later on will be combined into the main recording. And we want to sincerely thank Erin Eldridge and Sarah Margo from Canadian Hearing Services for interpreting for us today. And we thank CSC for providing funding for the interpretation service as well. There is also a closed captioning feature that can be found at the bottom of your screen with an option for translation in the language of your choice. So now I will turn it over to Dennis Herfst. He is the Area Director for the Metro Vancouver West Community Corrections. Thank you.
Thanks, Swayam. And good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us today. I also wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional unceded territory that we gather on today, and particularly the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. It's great to be with you all. My name is Dennis Herfst. I am the Area Director overseeing the Vancouver Parole District for the Correctional Service of Canada. So just a word about us within the Correctional Service. We have a dual mandate within our organization to ensure public safety while also assisting offenders in their rehabilitation and reintegration efforts in the community. In Vancouver in particular, we supervise approximately 225 offenders on release from our federal penitentiaries, and they are finishing their sentence under supervision in the community. And we do that in Vancouver with approximately 40 staff. That includes parole officers, program facilitators, mental health team, Indigenous staff, admin support, and then our supervisors and managers. And it's a real team approach in terms of our supervision of offenders in the community in particular. We work closely with many community partners and stakeholders, including the police, including many nonprofit organizations that run halfway houses where many of our offenders are required to reside. And we also work closely with our Citizen Advisory Committee. The acronym we use for that is CAC. So that's our Citizen Advisory Committee. And so just a word about them. They are groups of volunteers from the community. And we have CACs attached to each federal penitentiary and parole office across the country. And their role, it's enshrined right in our legislation, their role is to observe, liaise, and advise on our correctional operations and practices and policies. And so these are groups of volunteers from the local communities, and that's why they're attached to the local offices and penitentiaries where they're at. And they have the ability to access our penitentiaries, our halfway houses, our parole offices. They can meet with staff, they can meet with offenders. So really, they are the eyes and ears of the community, representing the community. And so again, their role is to observe, liaise, and advise. And so I'm very fortunate here in Vancouver to work with a great local citizen advisory committee. It's them that really have taken initiative with these webinars. This is now our 6th annual webinar, and we're very excited about that this morning. In particular, this started in 2020, kind of that first year of COVID, you'll remember, and we were looking for ways to engage in some outreach. And that was at a time when we couldn't get together in person, as everybody will recall. And so here we are now, 5 years later, and this is our 6th webinar. Previous webinars have been on aging offenders, on the needs of victims, and digital literacy and corrections, just to name a few. We do have close to 400 people registered for this event. I know not everybody is able to join us live today, but we do have people registered from around Canada. I think we have 8 different states down in the United States represented, people from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Fiji, Kenya, and Nigeria, to name a few. So that's very exciting. You'll note this has really become an international flavor, these webinars, and it's great to see so many people joining from so many different provinces and states and countries. These do attract a wide audience of correctional professionals, police officers, nonprofit organizations, healthcare practitioners, researchers, policymakers, students, and people with lived experience. So again, we're excited for today's webinar. For our guest speakers, I'll say at the outset, thank you. Thank you for taking your time. We have speakers from around the world here, taking time out of their busy schedules to join us and share their knowledge and insights, and we're most grateful to them. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Eddy Elmer. Eddy is the vice chair of our local Citizen Advisory Committee here in Vancouver. He is also the chair of our Pacific Regional CAC Committee, and he's also the vice chair of our National Executive Committee for CACs in Canada. So Eddy, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. As you were speaking, I just noted that we have people who are joining us live all the way from New Zealand and Fiji. So it's pretty early in the morning over there. So we really appreciate all of you joining us. And thank you, Dennis, very much for supporting our Citizen Advisory Committee and hosting these webinars. So my name is Eddy Elmer. I am a PhD student in social gerontology. It's the study of aging, and I focus on mental health. I'm also on the board of governors at the Justice Institute of British Columbia, and I'm also co-chair of the Vancouver Police Department Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Liaison Committee. My interest in corrections was piqued by my studies in gerontology when I learned about the rapid aging of our prisoner population, and that's what led me to join my local CAC all the way back in 2019. And since then, I've become quite interested in a variety of issues relating to corrections, but especially matters pertaining to social isolation, loneliness, and stigma, which I think are actually quite relevant for today's topic, as we'll hear from our speakers. So, as we know, individuals in custody or under community supervision who are deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and or low vision face distinct challenges in institutional and community settings. Today's webinar will explore how hearing and visual impairments can affect health, communication, safety, rehabilitation, and reintegration. We will gain some insights into screening, accommodation, collaboration strategies, and how to strengthen accessibility and inclusion across correctional and community settings. So we're very pleased to be joined today by 4 distinguished speakers. We have Dr. Laura Kelly-Corless, who's a senior lecturer in criminology at the School of Law and Policing at the University of Central Lancashire. She's joined by her colleague, Dr. Daniel McCulloch, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Criminology and Social Policy at the Open University in UK. We have Dr. Tracey Bone, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. And we have Margo Schlanger, who is the Wade H. and Doris M. McCree Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. To start off our webinar, we will have Dr. Kelly-Corless and Dr. McCulloch speaking together. And so they'll have a two-part presentation. And in the first part, they will talk about experiences of people within our institutions. And then in the second part, it'll be experiences of people on release. So I'll give just a little bit of a longer introduction to Dr. Laura Kelly-Corless. She is a leading scholar on the experiences of deaf people in prison, and she has contributed to greater awareness and policy development to support accessibility and equity in correctional settings. Her British Academy-funded research has been widely published, and she received the Prison Service Journal Outstanding Article of the Year Award in 2017. Her work has attracted national media attention, including an expert appearance on BBC 2's See Here program. She serves as an expert advisor to His Majesty's Prison and Probation Service, the Parole Board, and the Prison and Probation Ombudsman. Her research has informed interpreter training in prisons and led to the creation of the Deafness and His Majesty's Prison and Probation Working Group in 2023. So Swayam, I'll turn it to you to introduce Dr. McCulloch.
Sure. Thank you, Eddy. Thank you, Dr. Dan McCulloch. Dr. McCulloch is a senior lecturer in the Department of Criminology and Social Policy at the Open University, UK. He has a long-standing research interest in the experiences of deaf people in prison, first explored in a 2010 report for the Howard League for Penal Reform. His recent work examines the lives of culturally deaf people after release from prison, the first research of its kind in the UK. Dr. McCulloch served as the academic expert on the BBC Ideas segment, Deaf Behind Bars, and co-chairs the Deafness and His Majesty's Prison and Probation Working Group with Dr. Laura Kelly-Corless. In addition to his work on deafness and justice, excuse me, he's an experienced researcher on homelessness and a co-editor of the forthcoming Palgrave Handbook of Social Justice 2026. And with that said, I think we'll hand it over to Laura and Daniel for their presentations. Thank you.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you very much for that absolutely lovely introduction. Just while Dan shares the slides, just say, yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. We are both based in England, so it's a pleasure to speak to such a varied audience, obviously based in Canada primarily, and thank you so much for inviting us, giving us this opportunity. So like has already been said, our presentation is split into two parts. So first of all, we're going to be talking about the experiences of deaf people in prisons, based on our knowledge and experience in the context of prison. And then we're going to be looking in England, and then we're going to be looking at post release experiences, reintegration experiences, and again that relates predominantly to England. So yeah, thank you for having us, and we will get started.
So we'll start off by just saying a little bit about ourselves. So to give you a bit of context about who we are, we've carried out research and published about the experiences of deaf people's experiences in and after prison, both previously and we continue to do so. In addition to that, we've supported organisations such as the Prison and Probation Service in England and Wales, the Parole Board, the Prison and Probation Ombudsman, on their practice with this population. So we've tried to engage with different services. And a big part of that is, as was mentioned in the introduction, the collaboration with the Prison and Probation Service on the Deafness and Prisons Working Group, in which we work closely with them. We've also submitted evidence to UK government committees about the experiences of deaf people within the criminal justice system. And we've produced resources to support services in meeting the needs of deaf people. Laura produced Think Deaf materials that aim to support prisons in meeting the needs of deaf people. We've worked together to produce the Deaf After Prison resources that we'll come on to talk to a little bit later on. And then recently as well, we've been involved in the BBC Ideas short film Deaf Behind Bars and the creation of a free educational resource alongside this that looks at life after prison for deaf people.
Okay, so just some context as to what we are referring to when we talk about deafness. Many people in the call are probably going to be aware of this already, but I think it's really important to situate our discussion within these definitions. So deafness is an extremely broad spectrum, and I think what might come out of this session is that maybe some different terminology and language is used across different jurisdictions. So that may be the case. As I'll be interested to see how that plays out. But yeah, so we have taken our sort of terminology from Deaf Studies Conventions, which is where the little d and the big D come in. We are referring to little d deafness in relation to the audiological condition, based on the amounts of sounds or the types of sounds that somebody is able to hear. And then we have got the big D deafness, which links to what is known in the UK and international literature as well, in relation about belonging to the deaf community. So the deaf community is known as being a cultural linguistic distinct group, made up of people that use in the UK British Sign Language, or I think it's ASL in the context of Canada, but yeah, so a visual based sign language, and view their deafness as a sort of valued characteristic, prefer to sorry, my internet just broke up slightly there. Prefer to be around other deaf people socially, personally, in the workplace, wherever possible, sort of thing. It's a very tight knit cultural community. So the levels of the experiences of deaf people are overlap because of the sort of lack of access to sound, but then differ because of the differences in identification. There are significant nuances there, but for the purpose of this presentation, that's all we'll sort of say on that. What we have found to date, which is not what this presentation is about, but what we always think is really important to recognise, is that we do recognize our role as hearing researchers. We tread very carefully in how we methodologically navigate our research and the research process as outsiders, particularly in relation to the deaf community as outsiders to a very tight-knit and oppressed group. So methodologically, it's been very difficult to navigate and continues to be.
So before we come on to talk about prisons in particular, there are adjustments that might be made for deaf people or might be expected to be made more generally. And some of those are irrespective of identity, talking about big D and little d deaf individuals here. So often require access to specialised equipment that can help them to live without sound during their day-to-day lives within a kind of hearing-dominated world. So this might include things like vibrating alarm clocks, flashing fire alarms, telephone-related technology, hearing aids, and hearing loop systems. And then in addition to this, culturally and linguistically deaf individuals usually require access to either a sign language interpreter or other communication support for things like everyday interactions with hearing people in contexts such as universities, education based settings, workplaces, hospitals, legal appointments, these kinds of things. So what we probably see is that deaf people's experiences really exist against a backdrop of what we might call hearing privilege, where deaf people are already discriminated against in a number of ways because society is oriented around hearing norms and hearing culture and rules and sound and expectations. And because hearing people are really quite unaware of their entitlement in this context, and to some degree unaware of the deaf community and their needs and norms and values.
So we're going to move on now to like in the wonderful introduction has been said, to talk about the lives and experiences of deaf people in prison, and we're going to cover audiologically deaf and then culturally and linguistically deaf people. This relates significantly to our research to date. We are both carried out significant multiple projects in relation to the experiences of deaf people in prisons in England. So why is this important and why now? So some context again from our jurisdiction. So English literature research based in England and internationally indicates and shows very strongly that deaf people in prisons experience pain, deprivation and suffering far beyond that which is expected as per their sort of sentence.
Laura, I just want to note, I think something happened to your audio. It's difficult to hear you. Cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I don't know when did you stop being able to hear me?
So I think probably start the point again about deaf prisoners' experience and deprivation.
Oh, technology. Okay, so yeah, so deaf people have been sort of across international literature been shown to experience the sort of pains of imprisonment, the deprivations and suffering in prisons far beyond that which is expected during people's time in custody, as an outcome of their sentence. So those experiences are often far more harrowing, or particularly harrowing. And staff commonly report being unable to meet the needs of deaf people in prisons or not knowing how to. So a lack of knowledge and resource is key here. And like was said in relation to Canada, in England and Wales as well, there is very much an ageing population in prison, which means that this cohort is growing in terms of those that are audiologically deaf, given that people often begin to lose their hearing as they go through the aging process. So in our jurisdiction, we have had what's been coined as a landmark piece of legislation enacted relatively recently, the British Sign Language Act 2022, which recognises BSL as a language of England, Scotland and Wales for the first time. And domestically, this received a lot of attention and has led to some changes in expectations of public services. And so with that, and alongside sort of some awareness raising within popular culture, has brought significant attention to the rights of particularly culturally and linguistically deaf people for the first time, and also their existence, and that's both politically and publicly.
So you might be thinking, okay, how many deaf people are there in prison in England and Wales? And the answer is that there's no actual reliable data to give us a sense of this. There are a number of reasons for this, but one of the main ones is the lack of legal obligation to record this kind of data, this kind of information in relation to people. So what that leads to is a lack of accurate recording mechanisms. The systems that are used often don't have the requirement and the mechanism to be able to record this data accurately. In addition, this relies upon people asking adequate questions during a healthcare screening or during an induction process, things like this. And often those sorts of questions are inadequate and not really asked in a way that meaningfully gets at this information. And even when those questions are asked, because people don't necessarily know about the detail, they sometimes use those recording mechanisms in inconsistent ways. So there can be inconsistencies across different prisons. But even within a prison, there might be inconsistencies in terms of the way that this information is recorded. And here, definitions of deafness are actually quite important, because actually someone might be audiologically deaf, or they might be culturally and linguistically deaf. But if someone doesn't have an awareness of those differences, it's really unlikely that that's going to be recorded sufficiently within the data itself.
Okay, so as we said in relation to deafness and the lives of deaf people in wider society, the level to which someone is deaf has a significant impact on their behaviour and needs in prison. So audiologically deaf prisoners often want to significantly engage in prison life in the way that hearing prisoners do, and require access to hearing aids and other equipment in order to do so. Whereas many big D deaf people that we've interviewed, well, first of all, they communicate using sign language. They tend to anyway, value their deafness and utilize common deaf behaviors such as touching and prolonged eye contact, of course, and require access to sign language interpreters. A real key part of what's come out as being really key in our research to date is the sort of, as per many deaf people's sort of identities, they tend to view themselves as being intrinsically different to hearing people, preferring to be with other members of the deaf community. They're set where they sort of can be like a family, and viewing the hearing world with hostility and resentment, owing to their experiences in wider society, which are often very, very difficult, and very sort of oppressed, as per the fact that 90% of people born deaf are born to hearing parents.
So a little bit then about audiological deafness within prison. Well, the prison environment and culture is overwhelmingly built upon sound and dependent upon sound. There are things like alarms, tannoys, reliance on verbal communication between people. So without hearing, everything becomes harder. It becomes more difficult to engage with other people. It becomes harder to hear those sounds all around us. We'll talk about in a little bit more depth in a moment. So appropriate resources of the type that we spoke about earlier are really vital for deaf people to be able to access the prison regime, but are often not either available, people might not be allowed to use them, or they might not be well maintained. They might be in a poor condition and not work properly. And so prisoners are often also reliant upon an awareness, upon having adequate funding, upon having support from staff to enable them to access resources. But staff often actually report not being able to meet those needs, and sometimes actually not being inclined to meet those needs. And that can mean that prisoners miss out on what they need. So we've got a quote here that perhaps gets to some of this. So they're a bit parsimonious with the batteries. They'll give you one little card and that's it. And then when you queue up there, probably won't be any at the health kiosk. So it's one of intermittent supply, which causes great problems for us, because if you lose your hearing, you just can't function at all. Just trying to function as a prisoner doing the everyday things that are part of the system can be very difficult if you can't hear properly. So it really gets at the difficulty if you don't have access to sound within prison. And so for deaf prisoners then, without access to hearing aids and other sorts of equipment, they become quite isolated from prison life. There are issues hearing things like tannoys, being unable to hear the television, being unsafe because they can't hear either alarms ringing or people coming up behind them. So that sense of personal safety is a real issue for deaf prisoners. Also, there can be difficulty in communicating with doctors, solicitors, or partaking in education or training. So access to those more formal aspects of the prison regime, but those aspects are really important for taking care of your health needs, for being able to work towards parole. Those things are sometimes difficult for deaf people as well. And then on top of that, it's harder to communicate with family members outside of the prison, and that can lead to issues of isolation and loneliness and issues with maintaining those relationships that are so important upon release. And then difficulties in building relationships with other prisoners and with staff as well. And that can, of course, have real impacts within the prison environment itself. So again, we've got a couple of quotes that perhaps get to some of this. So this first one, I feel left out of much of the prison humour because I can't hear the small talk, kind of jokes and comments that cause laughter and smiles. And communication is really important in man-made volatile environments. And without a hearing aid, I found it hard to communicate, so I found it difficult. If I didn't have them, it would be impossible. The environment, more than any other, is all about communication. Without my hearing aids, I literally don't think I would be able to survive.
Okay, so in terms of the way people navigate this, what we found really interesting is that people often navigate it differently based on whether they've got any sort of residual hearing or the extent to which they're deaf. So people that are hard of hearing or maybe partially deaf, what we have found is, in light of what the prison environment is like in terms of being sort of hypermasculine, volatile, aggressive, oriented around a sort of hierarchy, and so on, people are very unwilling to want to be perceived as vulnerable, and associate deafness with that. So if they can, people will, one way to respond to this in prisons is to sort of pretend that they're hearing, to put on a front, and to try and pass as hearing. But a much more common response is to withdraw. So to withdraw from prison life and try and keep to themselves as much as is possible. Okay, so moving on to cultural and linguistic deafness in prison then. So we have interviewed or collected data with and about this population across multiple projects, sorry. We've found significantly that there is currently no space for such profound difference in prisons in England, because as Dan has already indicated, like sound, verbal communication plays a really key part in the prison regime. And because they need regular access to interpreters in order to participate meaningfully in prison life. However, people are often, I think is a bit of an understatement. I've never interviewed a person or engaged with a person that has had adequate or, consistent use of interpreters. Lack of opportunities to interact with other deaf people. Someone that's a member of the deaf community is often the only person in a particular prison that is identified in that way. And also, really importantly, a lack of deaf awareness on the part of staff members. So a lack of conception of the deaf community or the needs of somebody that is culturally and linguistically deaf. So this all, as you can imagine, creates a sort of an outcome of a really isolating experience for this population. They become almost completely isolated from the regime and communication with others. And it's effectively akin to sort of enforced solitary confinement, which is what we'd call it in the UK. I don't know if it's segregation or maybe something different in Canada. Like audiologically deaf prisoners, but to a greater extent, because of their sort of language difference, they are largely unable to participate in education, training, or rehabilitative programs, to access meaningful medical assistance or legal aid, or to gain a meaningful understanding of the regime. And in England and Wales, we have something called sentence plans, which people need to complete and meaningfully engage with in order to show a parole board that they no longer pose a risk or their risk has been reduced. But it can be almost impossible to understand and fulfill requirements of sentence plans, given that most things aren't accessible to them. And this can be particularly problematic for people serving indeterminate sentences. So again, there are multiple types of sentences in England and Wales whereby people don't have an end date. And a really significant issue that the comment just came up. A really significant consequence of the lack of deaf awareness is that staff have been shown to misunderstand aspects of deaf culture. So the gestural nature of sign language can put them at a greater risk of being interpreted as aggressive or disruptive or being hostile. Lack of responses can give a perception of ignoring staff or other prisoners, and some culturally deaf norms such as touching and so on can be deemed as acting inappropriately. Also, we have had sort of in instances where we've carried out research in a prison where there was more than one deaf person that used sign language. The data from prisoners and staff showed that staff often viewed people signing to each other suspiciously because they didn't know what they were saying, and there were informal attempts to ban sign language on one particular wing. The isolation is sort of, again, further is ingrained, that's the word, by the fact that even very well-meaning prison staff who don't know how best to sort of navigate the needs of a member of the deaf community, they often attempt to communicate in inappropriate ways. So speaking louder, writing things down, and in one instance relying on other deaf people who can speak and sign, could speak and sign, to actually interpret, which gave a really sort of unprecedented level of power in that context.
So, as you can imagine, this has really significant impacts on deaf people's mental health. So, first of all, the isolation and loneliness that comes from this because of a lack of ability to communicate and interact with other people, staff members, prisoners, family members outside the prison. Depression that can lead from this loneliness and isolation, and this inability to communicate with others, and this sense of hopelessness. Paranoia, because of the vulnerability that people experience because of perceptions of weakness that are related to difference within prisons, and not being able to hear people talking about you, not being able to know whether people might be plotting something about you. So all of these kinds of things. And then stress. To some degree, all prisoners will experience stress, but actually deaf prisoners experience this at a heightened level because of the isolation, because of the paranoia, and also because of not being able to navigate the prison regime in ways that other prisoners can. And this can also result in fear due to not knowing, due to that reliance upon other people and having to place your absolute trust in other people. And that can make you vulnerable. If you put your trust in the wrong person, that can have really grave consequences, and really, really severe. And then this real sense of frustration, not knowing who to turn to or where to go for one's needs to be met. Actually, that sense of what you do, it's really difficult to make that first step if you don't know about the prison regime and how it works. So again, this quote gets to some of this. Sometimes I cry just because I'm in prison. I cry a lot because there's nobody deaf. There's nobody deaf here. I can't communicate. I can't express myself to anybody. So that real sense of the toll on an individual's mental health is clear here.
So in terms of how members of the deaf community respond to these issues, they often aren't completely unique. So deaf people in wider society often face some similar issues, particularly being excluded from sort of hearing families, excluded in schooling, and a lack of adjustment when using public services. But this because of the nature of the prison environment is often exacerbated or made much more sort of severe. They can respond through known existing methods of coping, so things like withdrawing or trying to stay away from hearing people or associating with other deaf people, which often isn't something that they can actually do in a prison setting, and to complain. But it can be very difficult to get complaints taken seriously, or the complaint system hasn't been very accessible in England and Wales as well. And that can lead to a lack of trust in the complaints process, which is something that's not unique to this population. And I'm sure it's not unique to England and Wales either, that lack of trust in the sort of the integrity or, value of the internal complaints process. And something else that we have found as well, and we found this across different research, pieces of research, is that there is some very high quality secure psychiatric provision for members of the deaf community in England, and deaf people, even if they don't meet the conditions or the bar as such to be in one of those spaces, can actually want to be there because they won't be as isolated. But what we have also seen is that there is a lower bar for members of the deaf community to actually be sectioned and transferred to secure psychiatric spaces, and we've interviewed people that are able that make those decisions, and that is partly because it's a less harmful alternative, even if they don't meet the criteria. And then what that means is, even though in the shorter term it might be slightly easier for them because provision is better, they can actually get stuck in those spaces because it's difficult to prove a lack of a reduced risk, and also because community provision in England and Wales for the mental health support of deaf members of the deaf community is really, really lacking.
So finally then, we've spoken a little bit about those experiences, but we'll talk a little bit about what should happen for deaf prisoners in terms of an English and Welsh context. So in England and Wales, there is the Equality Act, and this places an emphasis upon ensuring a lack of discrimination for people with certain protected characteristics, one of which is disability. So part of the Equality Act places a duty on public services, such as the prison service, to make what are called reasonable adjustments to improve equality between those with and without disabilities. But there's an issue with this. There's a lot of ambiguity and therefore discretion over the interpretation of reasonableness in terms such as reasonable adjustments. So actually that idea of reasonableness is open to a lot of interpretation. And then on top of this, it forces deaf people to identify as disabled to access these elements, these provisions through the Equality Act. And that often then forces people to identify in ways that don't align with their own identities. So there's this conflation that's unhelpful here. More recently as well, there's the BSL Act, the British Sign Language Act that Laura spoke about at the start. And this places a duty on public services to feedback on progress and the strategies that they have in meeting the needs of British Sign Language users. But a key part of this was meant to be a requirement for guidance to be issued to government departments on the promotion and facilitation of the use of BSL. But this hasn't yet come into force, and there's no date by which it will come into force. So this key element is still missing. And then also the fallback piece of legislation for anything outside of BSL in relation to deaf people is still the Equality Act. So again, still deafness and disability conflated in ways that don't align to deaf people's own identities in lots of cases. Okay.
So this is now the second part of our presentation. So this is like the second slot as such, which is slightly shorter. So Eddie, do you want us to go straight into it?
Certainly, I just wanted to know, I really enjoyed that first part, and just particularly the impact that being deaf can have on one's sense of self, their mood, the feelings of connection with other people, and just feeling really different, and then all the issues relating to safety. And I'm thinking some of those are the same issues that people have once they're on release, but there are also unique challenges when you're on release, because now you're moving into a very different, less controlled environment, and that can be fraught with all sorts of difficulties as well, I imagine. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, so this element of the presentation focuses on the experiences of deaf people after prison. And again, our focus here was upon England in particular in terms of the jurisdiction. And the focus here is not on both audiologically and culturally and linguistically deaf people. It's only on culturally and linguistically deaf people. So there's a slight difference from that first half, if you like. And at this point, we just want to acknowledge as well that this research was supported by a British Academy grant, and we're grateful for that enabled this work.
Okay, so something that's really important to I think speak to is the legacy of the people's experiences of prison. As we've sort of talked through in detail, prison is a very, very traumatic place for members of the deaf community, very isolating and so on. And even though this research wasn't about prison, it was about those reintegration experiences. Experiences of prison were very prominent in discussions, and it was clear, as could be expected, they shaped people's post-prison experiences. So in England and Wales, rehabilitation is one of the key priorities in prison spaces, and the sort of reformation and rehabilitating people to you know, not commit any further crime as such. However, it's very clear that deaf people accumulate further trauma there, which actually makes it harder to successfully reintegrate and complicates that reintegration process. I've got a quote there, but I'm not sure we've got time to read through it.
So what does that mean then in terms of people's experiences within the context of probation within England and Wales? And just say here, I think when we're talking about probation, this might be what you might call parole. So we're talking about the organisation that people would be referred to after prison, after they're released from prison, that they have to engage with, have to meet with, and kind of fulfil the rest of their licence with, if you like. So people spoke to us about a number of issues here. So one really overarching thing was about a lack of joined up thinking within services and then across services as well. So different elements of a service might not talk, but even so, even if you move from one probation officer to another, that probation officer might not necessarily have explained to the other one what your communication needs are, for example, or any of your background or things like that, or your probation officer might be on holiday, so you have to communicate with a different probation officer or have to attend a different place and location. These kinds of things actually have a really big impact on people, even though they might seem quite small to someone else. A lack of consistent interpreter provision. People spoke about interpreters being booked at the wrong time, the wrong day, not necessarily turning up, or presuming that someone needed a particular type of interpreter or communication support, and actually that person needed a different kind of communication support. An interpreter might turn up and someone might say, well, can you help anyway? And they'd say, no, it doesn't work like that. Actually, you need someone else. And then you can't have the appointment. A more general lack of deaf awareness, a lack of understanding of deaf culture, history, why something might matter to a deaf person, why their values might differ slightly in terms of the core values that they might hold, and what that means for a deaf person engaging with a largely hearing-based service. And then a lack of clear communication about the details of things like legal requirements, things like license conditions, injunctions, even a sense of what probation is, what it means, why you have to engage with them, why you have to meet with them. These things can all lead to violations of license conditions and can lead to people being re-imprisoned. And so actually, without a clear understanding of that, it's really detrimental to deaf people engaging with probation. People also spoke to us about their experiences of public and community-based support services, so things like housing support services, health-based support services, things like this. So generally, access to services, to more generalised services, was not really equivalent for deaf people to hearing people. Essentially, those services were largely geared up for hearing people, and if you had appointments, you might not necessarily have an interpreter there. If you just walked into a service or needed ad hoc support, actually, really, you needed to be able to communicate in written or verbal English rather than BSL. And even where structured things might be set up, quite often they weren't set up in a way that made sense for BSL users. So people were quite often excluded from those services because they weren't accessible for deaf people. And then there weren't many specialist services for deaf people with convictions either. We did a scoping exercise and communicated with almost 130 organisations, I'm going to say off the top of my head. And we found only one community-based support group for deaf people with convictions running at the time in the whole of England. And that service has since ceased operating due to losing its funding upon which it relied. So deaf people are quite often then left to navigate systems and services themselves or with the support of trusted people, but quite often find that there aren't deaf specialist services that they can access. They're excluded in that way. And then also hearing-based services aren't accessible either. So they don't really have access to the kinds of services that they need.
So when I was doing my PhD was about deaf people in prisons, their lives in prisons. A key thing that the theme that came through from participants that I wasn't actually focused on at the time was their worries about being released and how members of the deaf community would respond to them, and whether they would be able to sort of rejoin or be reintegrated back into the deaf world. So that really was a really fundamental reason why we came to sort of do this research. And what we found through this particular research was that a lot of those worries weren't unfounded, and the deaf community often was not welcoming of former prisoners. There's questions from our data about whether the stigma of the offender label is heightened for deaf people. And there's a number of reasons that were really prominent within our data collection, which was the centrality of gossip within the deaf community, how much deaf people gossip and how prominent that is, which was then exacerbated by the fact that sign language is a visual language, which makes it hard to have private conversations. And then another layer of this was the smallness of the deaf world. So the deaf world is a culturally distinct minority group. So there is this notion of everyone knows everyone, and members of the deaf community often know members of the deaf community from, you know, the other side of the country or other countries and so on. And this means that it feels that this notion of everybody knowing everybody's business. So there wasn't this sort of people. What we found is people tend to become isolated or excluded from the deaf community after release from prison, both in terms of informal relationships and more formal sort of settings and groups and so on. And as you can imagine, given the amount of value that is placed on this, without the deaf community, deaf people become very isolated from social lives, lose their sort of social support network that was vital prior to prison, which is very important in terms of reintegration experiences, you know, those positive social relationships. And what we saw as well was that the stigma associated with the label could actually have consequent broader sort of negative ripple effects. So when there's a member of the deaf community that had been in prison, if there were family members that were also part of the deaf community, they were often sort of excluded or stigmatized. This also extended to service providers who support, like interpreters, for example, that supported members of the deaf community. They could have reported being vilified for that. Just got a really poignant quote here from a service provider who says most of them just disappear. I think they know if they set foot in the deaf clubs and pubs, people essentially gossip, and they've got increased paranoia. Will they talk about me? Are they going to plan to hurt me? If they do plan to hurt me, how do I protect myself? Lots of paranoid behaviors. Like, you know, it's not safe, it's better to stay at home, but then they become isolated, and that's got its own issues. The mental health goes downhill, and it's a vicious cycle. And this can then have this fear of the stigma, and the stigma attached to the sort of the offender label as such can lead to real anxiety around engaging with provision that is available for the deaf community, and it can lead to sort of purposeful withdrawal from services and a refusal to engage with the support that is available in case somebody finds out that they've been in prison. This was very so in this particular research, perhaps we should have said this, we interviewed people that had been in prison and also service providers that worked with them. And what this means is that this reluctance is that it makes it really hard for support services to actually thrive or survive, because people aren't willing to come forward because they're worried about, you know, being isolated or ostracized from the deaf community. We've got another quote that sort of illuminates this from a service provider who says, I know one referral, they decided to refuse to engage with us, so they are a deaf service, because the offender knew us. The deaf community is small. The deaf person would prefer to engage with hearing services. He was suspicious of us, so it's difficult. They were uncomfortable and wanted to be completely out of the picture, working with hearing services instead, which is understandable. Okay, so in terms of how they navigate and manage their lives post reintegration from prison, I'm sure, as you can imagine, with great difficulty, and some of this depended on other layers of their sort of lives. So whether they had family that they still engaged with. So in instances like that, people returned to previous hometowns that they knew, where they had family that, you know, would be there for them, or to go to a new town or a new area for a fresh start. But that was often very difficult, because even if they did move, the tight-knit nature of the deaf community then meant that the stigma sort of followed them as such. And then some people, you know, attempted to return to the deaf community, and, you know, had great difficulty doing so. Or what we found with a number of people was they actually withdrew from the deaf community and attempted to become part of the hearing community, because they felt that would be a way to start a new chapter, maybe, and to move away from that stigma that the deaf community attached to them, which is ironic given the fact that the hearing community is often viewed with great hostility by members of the deaf community. Or very commonly was to withdraw from society as much as possible. So then a quote to just highlight this. So I don't know, from a service provider again, I don't know of anyone that's turned their life around, and that's in over 20 years of working in the judicial system. I don't know anyone that's turned their life around 100% and gone on to get educated, get a job, have a family, whatever they want to do as part of their life, you know, to actually have a life. It's just the same old, and nothing seems to be done to scoop them out of that system and affect change.
Okay, so then, as Laura mentioned, and perhaps mentioned earlier on, we've produced some best practice resources for practitioners based on the findings from this project. So there's a written version and a BSL version. And in putting this together, we've consulted with the prison probation working group that we mentioned on earlier, and with multiple members of the deaf community, to try and ensure this is appropriate for and aware of deaf people's experiences and needs, kind of bearing in mind that we are hearing researchers. So we just want to give a flavour of some of the things that are there, although there are others too. So how can deaf people be better supported? Well, some of the things that people spoke to us about was for hearing dominated services to adapt to meet the needs of deaf people, rather than expecting deaf people to adapt to meet the needs of the service. That can mean things like appropriate communication support. Sometimes that's a sign language interpreter, but possibly other forms of communication support too, and if possible, working with people's preferences on that rather than presuming what would be right. Respecting deaf culture. As Laura spoke about earlier, hearing culture can be oppressive and disrespectful to deaf people. So actually turning this around and seeing this as an opportunity to show respect for deaf culture can change that sense of things within those interactions. Careful pre-release planning before leaving prison. Developing plans that consider the needs of deaf individuals and what they can access or might need support with, rather than presuming that they have equal access to hearing people within the community. Ensuring that people have the necessary understanding to be able to meet the requirements, so things like understanding license conditions. Otherwise, really, there's this risk that we're setting them up to fail. And wherever possible, minimizing that sense of judgment around it and being trauma informed. That stigma people will already feel very heavily and feel from lots of different directions. So actually services can compound that even more. Although, of course, we recognize that this needs to be balanced against the needs and the vulnerability of others. So this is really a form of kind of managed reintegration. As I say, there are other things that we talk about in that resource too. So thank you, that's us. I think that's everything that we've got to say. Thank you very much for listening. We'd be delighted to hear from you if you want to get in touch or get in contact, and we're happy to share the slides too if that's helpful.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, thank you so much. I thought that was a very rich, two very rich presentations about the personal experiences of people who are deaf and hard of hearing in prison. And it was interesting to hear about the UK context and to see what the similarities and differences are in Canada. Most of our audience is from Canada. And we'll also hear later on about the US context. But I have to say, my research area is isolation and loneliness. And so I was very interested in all those connections. And in particular, what we know, even with people who are hearing and don't have any sensory impairments, when people become isolated and lonely, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's people sort of spiral. They become more afraid of people. And so you imagine if you're in a prison environment where you're already more afraid of people because it's not necessarily the safest environment, this cycle can be exacerbated. And once people are stuck in that, we find that it's very, very hard for them to get out of that. And they end up becoming more paranoid. They withdraw from people even further. And that can lead to depression and low self-esteem and sleep problems and problems with cognition, which I think is a big thing because, as you mentioned, the prison population is aging. We are seeing more cognitive decline. And we do know there's interesting research showing links between hearing problems and cognitive decline and loneliness and isolation. So there's a whole, so many different things going on here. And so I just found this quite fascinating. But so thank you for that. Now we're going to turn up to a little bit more to the Canadian context and pull up my slide here. So we're going to hear from Dr. Tracey Bone, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba here in Canada. Prior to entering academia, she worked for the Correctional Service of Canada for 28 years in various roles. As a parole officer, she supervised offenders in the community who were first language users of Deaf American Sign Language. Her research began with her Master of Social Work thesis entitled Insiders in a Deaf World: Barriers for the Deaf Offenders in the Hearing Criminal Justice System. She has continued to work closely with deaf and hard of hearing individuals when conducting research into mental health, healthcare access, and resource development. Most recently, she has coordinated the ASL translation of online mental health content from the Canadian Mental Health Association. So we're very honored to have Dr. Bone with us today, and I will turn it over to her.
Thank you. I will share my slides. Hold on. All right. There we go. All right. I'm assuming you can see that and I can see me. So this is working well. All right. So thank you for that introduction, Eddy, and thank you to the earlier presenters. Very exciting information. It's not often that I get to sit through and observe, listen to a presentation from folks that have experience and great wisdom working with those that are deaf and hard of hearing. So it was quite informative. Thank you for that. So I've titled my presentation, oh, sorry, I'm going to start my timer here. I've titled mine Deaf Offenders, Balancing Justice and Human Rights. So given that there is, or there will be some overlap between what Laura and Danielle had talked about, you may hear some common terms, etc. But we know that often it is about repetition that can help us understand some content. So again, there will be probably some repetition and then looking at quite specifically the Canadian content. So a little bit about myself. In terms of a land acknowledgement, I come to you in Winnipeg, and you see the star there. This is Treaty 1 territory in the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji Cree, and the Deniz people, and the homeland of the Métis people as well. So that's where I'm coming to you from. And I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, again, right kind of in the center of Canada. So webinar learning objectives, what I hope folks gain from this particular part of the webinar is at the end of the webinar, attendees should be able to explain in general and building on what our earlier speakers talked about, the different identities within the larger deaf communities, report on the common challenges experienced by deaf offenders within the criminal justice system, describe appropriate and respectful engagement strategies when working with a person who's deaf, and describe appropriate strategies to work effectively with a sign language English interpreter. interesting, just as an aside, I'm teaching 2 graduate courses at the moment, and in one of my courses this past week, I had a friend and colleague from the deaf community in my class, and she's from the deaf community, and of course I had a sign language interpreter there, so it was informative for the students to be able to see and understand how to work with a sign language interpreter, and where do you look, who do you talk to, where are the questions from, etc. So it was the students reported it was very informative for them to not only learn about the deaf community, but also to learn how to communicate effectively with a deaf person. In American Sign Language, which is what we speak in Canada and North America, I will say ASL as for short, and this is the ASL sign for learn. So the intention is that there will be learning through this webinar, both from my colleagues as well as hopefully from my presentation as well. So a little bit about myself. Eddy did, thank you for that introduction. I am the youngest sibling of a deaf adult. His first language is sign language, and he and I communicate only through American Sign Language. I communicate with he and his wife, who is also deaf. So I've been involved in a variety of things in the deaf community for obvious reasons, because that is my background. My brother is the only deaf person in our family, and I'm the only family member who speaks and communicates in American Sign Language. And I use that both in my personal world and in my professional world as well. I'm also a service provider for one of our insurance agents or agencies here in the city of Winnipeg, and I am what they define as the sign fluent counselor. So if anyone is deaf or uses American Sign Language and wants a sign fluent counselor, then they're referred to me. So I'm very active in the deaf community and communicating through American Sign Language. So I define myself as an inside outsider. I'm able to communicate within the community very well, but admittedly, I am not born to the deaf community. I have a family member who's deaf, which kind of brings me tighter into the community than perhaps other folks. So Correctional Service of Canada, as we had talked about earlier, has federal government department in Canada that both incarcerates and prepares adult offenders serving federal sentences of 2 years to life and prepares those offenders for release, and also supervises those offenders once they're released into the community. So as Eddy pointed out, I worked for the Correctional Service of Canada for 28 years. Part of that was as a parole officer in the community. I only ever worked in the community. I would obviously have to visit offenders in the institutions, but my function and role was in the community. If ever we had a deaf offender that was in the institution that was closest to my location, so some of you may know Stony Mountain Institution or Rockwood Institution, if there was a deaf offender there, I would engage with them. If a deaf offender was released into the community, then I would be assigned to supervise them. We also, through the Correctional Service of Canada, supervise provincial offenders as well in the province of Manitoba, where I'm from. So if ever there was a deaf offender in the being released into the city of Winnipeg, I also supervised them. But I was able to, through my 28 years working both Winnipeg parole and through a number of assignments with our national headquarters in Ottawa, was able to develop, I think, a really rich and broad exposure to Correctional Service of Canada and how it operates. Now, we know the mission of the Correctional Service of Canada is quite simply to protect society. It is obviously broader than that, but that is one of the key missions of the Correctional Service of Canada. So keeping that in mind, protecting society. Now, I want to change the focus for a minute. I want to talk about discrimination. Now, some of you may have seen this or used this in your various work setting, etc. And I apologize, I'm looking at my larger screen and I see that it's not particularly clear. But we commonly think of discrimination as ableism or classism or ageism, as Eddy is familiar with, or sexism, etc. But there is another type of discrimination, and it was discussed earlier. Discrimination that's defined as audism. So audism refers to the direct, indirect, and/or discrimination of or prejudice against people who are lowercase d, capital case D deaf or hard of hearing because of the differences from the hearing majority. Now, some of you may know this term was first coined in 1975 by Tom Humphreys, who was at the time a deaf PhD candidate working on his PhD thesis. So what does this mean? And I think our earlier speaker certainly talked about the different types of experiences and discrimination that autism brings to folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. So again, autism is the notion or idea that one is superior based on behaving or hearing like the idea that one is superior based on hearing or behaving like someone who hears and speaks. So in other words, you are inferior if you don't communicate through hearing and speaking. If you haven't seen this documentary, I certainly recommend it. It is from 2003. 57 minutes, but it's an excellent documentary, and it involves a number of individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. They may have cochlear implants, which is another form of technology that allows some folks to hear more carefully or more clearly. And it discusses autism, and it discusses not only what autism is, or that form of discrimination, but more importantly, the impact of autism, the impact on mental health, on well-being, on sense of isolation, on engagement with community members and engagement with members outside of the community. So if you haven't had a chance to view this, I certainly recommend you trying to locate it. You can't stream it in Canada. I'm not sure if it's accessible through other streaming services. It's available at our university or at my university, for example, and may be available in other ways, might be at your library. But it certainly is an excellent documentary on the impact of the type of discrimination that most specifically impacts deaf people. What I want to do just very quickly is do a quick introduction, and I appreciate the quotes that were provided in the earlier presentation from your research studies. So Matthew is an individual, not his real name, but Matthew is an individual I dealt with when I was a parole officer. He was in his mid-30s and from a northern community. He is deaf and is the only deaf person from that northern community. Now, he also has 48 separate convictions, and most of them are for violence against RCMP. Part of the reason for that is pretty clear. So this fellow is deaf. Because he was isolated in his home community and because he had no one else to communicate with directly, he was unemployed in his community and he developed an alcohol problem. So he drank most days and almost all day throughout the day. And as you can imagine, sometimes his behavior became disruptive. And often what would happen is he would be disruptive in the community and the local RCMP would be called. So they would arrive. But of course, Matthew couldn't hear them if they arrived behind him. And unfortunately, no one from the hearing community would point out the fact that an RCMP officer is approaching him from behind. And what would happen is the RCMP officer would grab him from behind, he would panic, throw his arms back, and inevitably hit yet another RCMP officer in the face or in the body and be charged with violence against the RCMP. So we see significant discrimination here. Why the RCMP didn't step in front of him remains to be seen, but that was the case. He had accumulated 48 separate convictions. Now, I supervised him in Winnipeg while he was on statutory release. And at one point, although he was doing well, at one point, I went to see him in the community and he was clearly intoxicated. He was also covered in blood. He had been in a fight while playing cards with some of his housemates in the apartment where he was living. So when I approached him and I was signing to him, I said, well, it looks like you're intoxicated. He said, yep, I'm definitely drunk. I said, well, I'm sorry, but you have to go back to custody. He said, I understand. So the police were called and I waited with him while the police arrived. And sorry, I'm going to back up here. And you will see what happens when offenders or individuals are arrested. They are handcuffed behind their back. So I had said and pointed out to the officer, well, if you handcuff him behind his back, he can't communicate. He speaks through American Sign Language. He needs his hands. And the officer said to me rather bluntly, well, go talk to the chief of police and tell him about it. So I did, given that I worked with police, But I did ask and say, well, you do appreciate that handcuffing this person, a deaf person, behind his back is the same as putting tape on a hearing person. So he was not impressed with that connection. But anyways, I did speak with the police, but that's another whole story. So needless to say, it was difficult for this offender to be arrested with his hands behind his back if he's a sign language communicator. What I wanted to do was, not knowing the depth of terminology that would be discussed earlier, was discuss some of the important terminology. And I think you've heard most of it here. Using deaf, spelt with a capital D, is a sociological term that refers to the collectivist culture and the identity of individuals who participate in a shared culture, a shared society, a history, and values, noting that it's not defined by degree of deafness, but engagement with the deaf community. Some people attended residential schools or a deaf school, others did not. Storytelling is an important component of the deaf community. And of course, the word deaf spelled with lowercase d refers to the audiological condition of not hearing. Now, a couple of other components here. We also look at deafened or late deafened, which refers to those who were born hearing, have a hearing identity, but lose hearing after they have acquired language. And in many cases, they remain as with a hearing identity, but it makes it difficult if they then can't hear. So that changes the dynamics of communication. Now, Eddy did introduce my 1998 master's thesis. And why is that important? I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I want you to keep in mind, as I finish through my presentation, the year of my master's thesis. It was 1998. There were a number of barriers that were identified at that time that the Correctional Service or some of the barriers and recommendations. Recommendations were that Correctional Service of Canada determined the number, demographics, and needs of the deaf and hard of hearing offenders in the federal corrections, that sign language interpreters be brought on board as a contract, not brought on board for individual separate meetings, that case management staff and program staff develop a critical consciousness about working with offenders who are deaf, offenders being both inmates and parolees, so those in the community, and that the Correctional Service of Canada develop a culturally sensitive, barrier-free learning and rehabilitative environment for deaf offenders and prepare them for release. Also to have technology within the systems that allow for communication. That was 1998. In 2015, I was an expert witness for a federal offender complaint. And these were some of the concerns that were raised, virtually identical to the concerns that were raised in my 1998 master's thesis. Lack of knowledge about deaf culture on the part of staff, lack of respect for American Sign Language as a unique language, no accessible programming. Programming was available, and deaf offenders were invited to that programming, but they were not provided American Sign Language interpreters, therefore it was not accessible. And in segregation, there were no mental health supports in American Sign Language. Clearly, all of these being an example of autism. In 2018, there was another report that was done looking at deaf people's experiences in the criminal justice system as a whole. There were significant gaps, again, many of which are identical to the 2015 report I wrote and my 1998 master's thesis. Lack of knowledge of deaf culture and language, lack of accessible information, and autism, lack of respect for ASL or American Sign Language as a unique language and a unique mode of communicating. In 2021, yet another report, an edited book looking at deaf people in the criminal justice system. And looking at summarizing some of the key points, the legal aspects about advocacy, education, and action in all fields. So the solutions have been recommended again and again and again, and unfortunately are not being adopted within the criminal justice system. In terms of data, well, quite frankly, we don't know how many folks are deaf or hard of hearing in the criminal justice system, whether in the Canadian prisons or in the community, or throughout the criminal justice system as a whole. In 2021, a Senate report of Canada looked at the human rights of federally sentenced persons and they found 12 offenders in 2019 who were either deaf or hard of hearing. 12. And we have approximately 23,000 folks in the federal criminal justice system overall within Correctional Service of Canada. So in federal prisons and in the community. So 12. Difficult then to have a mass of individuals or to have all the deaf offenders in one particular institution. So I admit that's a problem, but clearly the issues that have been discussed are very real, regardless if you are one individual or 12. So when we think about the criminal justice system in Canada, of course, it involves the police, the courts, the prisons, and conditional release. Talking about the police being arrested with your hands behind your back in court, having a lawyer, the lawyer oftentimes doesn't understand deaf culture or how to work with a deaf person. There may not be an interpreter. In the prison, as I've talked about, no ASL interpreter or programming not accessible. Without attending programming, deaf offenders are not reducing their risk to reoffend and therefore remain in custody longer and less likely to earn early release and therefore remain in custody longer. And when thinking about release, without a conduit to two-way communication, they are less likely to seed in the community or gain skills for after their sentence end. For deaf sign language users, some common challenges as well is issues like American Sign Language as a visual language waves. Folks wave to get attention. They tap someone on the shoulder. You can't tap someone on the shoulder in a federal prison. It just is simply not acceptable. Using sign language and the hand, quote, movements have often been misinterpreted within the carceral setting and outside. Looking at storytelling is another important piece associated with American Sign Language. When a deaf person tells a story, they adopt the emotion of the person that they are telling the story about. So if I, as a deaf person, am telling a story about someone that's angry, I'm going to adopt that facial expression, my body language, my hand movements, etc. And in a prison setting, that's very threatening to prison guards because they don't understand how American Sign Language works or what the language is all about. One of the other key pieces is scanning the environment. Deaf people depend on vision as opposed to hearing. So in a prison setting, which is audio-centric, it's based on sound. If a deaf person can't hear all those sounds, can't hear all the officers, for example, calling them or instructions, they can't hear what's going on behind them, they're going to be scanning the environment. Scanning the environment in a prison setting causes concern for prison officers. They generally don't understand why someone is scanning the environment the way they are, and so it causes concern. Not understanding that scanning the environment is necessary for someone who doesn't have access to hearing. Now, there's a couple of factors, and I'm looking at my time here. Certified interpreters versus family and staff. It's important to use American Sign Language English certified interpreters. First off, they're trained in the two languages. They're certified through a national organization. They're bound by a code of ethics. And most importantly, they're fluent in both languages. We also have what's called certified deaf interpreters, who are deaf individuals who are certified to serve as the conduit between a sign language interpreter who does have sophisticated signing skills and a deaf person who doesn't have that same level of sophistication. Now, that is opposed to using staff or inmates or family or friends who are not professionally trained, unless, of course, they are. Finger spelling. Many staff or inmates or family or friends understand finger spelling, but don't understand that you can't simply finger spell an entire communication. It's just not going to work. And using an inmate or parolee is in violation of a deaf person's right to privacy. It also violates the deaf person's right to language access, and there's no guarantee that the information being transmitted is accurate. Now, there are several laws or conventions within Canada that are relevant. I'm having problems here with this. United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so equal recognition before the law and access to justice. We can look at the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Article 14, which says a party or witness in any proceedings who does not understand or speak the language in which the proceedings are conducted and who is deaf has the right to the assistance of an interpreter. And of course, looking at equality before the law, including physical disability. We can look at Accessible Canada Act and, we'll move that one. Just moving quickly through some of the practical issues that are important. This is a traditional classroom where folks are seated one in front of the other. For the person in the back, they can't see the white-haired person in the front who may be using sign language. So instead, it's important to adjust programming to have a seating arrangement that is appropriate for deaf folks. Handouts, for example, must be available. If they're in English, there should also be versions available, whether it's a video of that English translation so the deaf person can also access it. Something else you may have seen if you work in the area of domestic violence, strategies for workers. This is a power and control wheel, which is commonly used. But more importantly, this is a power and control wheel that's specific to folks who are deaf or hard of hearing. You can see that the format is different and it meets the needs of a person who's deaf or hard of hearing. Just like this one is focused on equality, but also specific to someone who's deaf or hard of hearing. So there's a number of strategies for working with, for justice workers working with the deaf and hard of hearing. I'm just going to go through some of these. One is taking responsibility for learning, respecting identity, and understanding sign language basics, but also planning. If you're having a meeting with a deaf person and an interpreter, planning accordingly, because sign language can add time to the meeting itself, and using assessment tools that are relevant, using sign language interpreters that are trained, looking at speaking at the deaf person. I'm clearly going through these. These are going to be in the recording, however, so you will have access to them, and please send me your, if you have a request for the PowerPoint as well. In the West Coast Prison Justice Society, there was a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal to hear the case of a deaf person in prison. That case has gone before the tribunal, and we are now pending the decision. So access to justice, yes, balancing the rights of deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind offenders and the mandate of all aspects of the Canadian justice system to uphold the law. So there is a balance, but we must respect the rights of deaf and hard of hearing. Thank you. My apologies, I was slightly over there. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Tracey. Again, that was a wonderful presentation. Very, very informative. As I'm listening to all these presentations, I am reminded about how important our sense of hearing is to our own survival and sense of safety. And it's one of our most highly honed senses over many years of evolution. And because it kept us safe, being aware of your environment is really important for safety. So I appreciated all of that in all the presentations. Tracey, very much appreciated the discussion about discrimination and autism, and the case of Matthew, which was very sad. And it made me think a little bit about that notion of cumulative disadvantage. And such as one thing leads to another, and before you know it, like you're just in a really deep hole. And then all of the discussion about police practices and how they can be improved. And I certainly will talk about some of these things with my police colleagues to see what their approach is to dealing with people who have hearing impairments. So yeah, this was really good, and I definitely loved the practical suggestions on how we can make accommodations within our system. There have been recommendations over many years, but as I've noticed, a change is slow, but it can happen. And the best change is sort of the slower change. It's the longest lasting, most durable change. But thank you so much for that. We're going to turn to Swayam now to introduce our next speaker.
Great, thank you, Eddy. So for our final guest speaker, we have Margo Schlanger. Margo is the Wade H. and Doris M. McCree Collegiate Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. After clerking for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she worked as a trial attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, investigating mistreatment within prisons and police departments. She's a leading expert on civil rights and conditions of confinement, and her work is frequently cited by courts and policymakers. Her scholarship includes analysis of the legal duty of care owed to incarcerated people with hearing and visual impairments and how correctional systems can accommodate them. She founded the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse and has served as an independent monitor and expert in prisoners' rights cases. She also served on national commissions on prison safety and reform and was a reporter for the American Bar Association's Standards on the Treatment of Prisoners. She is the lead author of Incarceration and the Law, and as well as leading casebook on correctional law. So, Margo, I will hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to talk, as you'll hear, a fair amount about deaf and blind and low vision and low hearing prisoners, but my approach is going to be a little bit more of a pan disability approach, and I think that hopefully will add some helpful context and kind of broaden the conversation a little bit. I want to start by, I'm going to share screens and just show you a resource that might be of interest to some of the people here. So just give me a second. So this is the Civil Rights Litigation Clearinghouse, which is a website that I run that provides information and documents from American civil rights cases. And if it's at clearinghouse.net. If you go to it and you go to special projects, you'll see under special projects, there's a white paper series about a number of different things. And one of them is a set of resources about effective communication with deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and low vision folks behind bars. And in that white paper, what we have is, a summary, the white paper itself, which is going to be the source of a good deal of what I talk about here, but then also a bunch of other things. A set of proposed policies, which are in the white paper, another webinar, which might be of interest to people, and a series of cases here, which involve the issues that we're discussing here. So these are large-scale civil rights cases in the United States that have to do with deaf, hard of hearing, blind, and low vision prisoners. And I thought that might be a useful resource for folks, so I just wanted to share it. Okay, let me exit out of there and come back to what I have to say. So, a few years back, I finished a 5-year appointment as what's called a settlement monitor in a state prison system for a pretty big civil rights case, which was about deaf and hard of hearing people who were incarcerated in that state. It was a class action, so it was about all of the folks in that situation. And I had been appointed by a federal court to spend time in the state's prisons, to talk to prisoners, to talk to staff, to review records and visit facilities. And what I saw was some very obvious problems. You've heard about quite a few of those today. For example, I recall one deaf prisoner who used American Sign Language to communicate and was entirely nonverbal in any oral language. He was found to have committed a pretty serious disciplinary infraction at a proceeding where he was handcuffed. So he couldn't communicate at that proceeding at all. He couldn't tell his side of the story. And he was subjected to some pretty serious consequences for that disciplinary infraction. So there was another deaf prisoner, again, who signed and again, who couldn't speak. This particular prisoner was illiterate in written English. And he had sat utterly incommunicado at his parole hearing because no interpreter was provided. But he was illiterate. He couldn't read. And so he didn't know what they meant. So, and then equally obvious and a very big issue in the case was that deaf prisoners could not use telephones. Because they weren't able to communicate, they weren't able to speak, they weren't able to hear, and the result of that was that they were unable to talk to their families for the entire period of their incarceration, unless their families came to visit them, which was quite difficult often. Okay, so that's a set of pretty obvious issues. And the prison knew when they signed the settlement in that case that those were issues they were going to have to solve. But it turned out that there were a lot of other issues that were a little bit less obvious. The part of the reason that we're having this conversation about deaf and hard of hearing prisoners is because prisons are such unhospitable environments for everybody, really, but particularly for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. Because prisons are congregate settings, because they have hard surfaces, because American prisons, at least, tend to be quite crowded, their spaces jam together a lot of functions, and the resulting din is a stressor. It's a stressor for everybody, but for a person with poor hearing, you really couldn't design a worse environment. And so the result of that for folks who were hard of hearing in this state's prisons were just that over and over and over again, they were unable to access both necessities and other opportunities. They couldn't hear pill call. They couldn't hear announcements about programs. They couldn't, over and over and over, they were deprived of equal access to the program services and activities at the prison. So prompted by the lawsuit, the state again knew they had to solve that first set of obvious problems. But what they didn't realize, what they weren't really cognizant of, was how urgent it was to solve the second set of problems as well, the less obvious problems. And so what was interesting about this is that actually, in some ways, both sets of problems were fairly easy, fairly straightforward to solve. Not always, but in large part. For the first set of issues, they needed interpreters. They needed to come up with ways to, if they were worried about security for prisoners who use sign language, they needed to come up with cuffs that, stopped at the elbow so that people could sign. They needed to have video phones for people who used ASL to talk to their families. And those were fairly easy, not necessarily cheap, but pretty straightforward to solve. But to solve the second set of problems, likewise, it could have been pretty easy. They needed phones with amplification. They needed visual and tactile alerts. They needed better access to hearing aids. They needed a whole bunch of other modifications, but none of it was really rocket science. It's all like fairly straightforward as these things go. But it took several years to get the prison to focus on that second set of problems. And part of the reason for that is that solving that second set of problems required something that is in very, very short supply in jails and prisons. And what that is individuation and accommodation, where the individual needs and a very varied set of individual needs of people with disabilities are incorporated into official decision making. And where those individual needs are not dismissed because they only apply to 1 or 2 or 10 people in a big facility, where individual needs are outweighed only when there's a pretty muscular reason that they're not going to work, such as, for example, a serious safety risk. So the insight that equality sometimes requires individualization, and accommodation is a really broad pan-disability insight. It doesn't just apply to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. It doesn't just apply to people who are blind and low vision. It applies across the board to people with all kinds of disabilities. And not only that, it's actually a still broader insight that applies to everybody. And we could really learn from what's needed for prisoners with disabilities. We could learn what might be helpful in shifting our incarcerative institutions into a situation that's a more humane and less damaging situation. Okay, so that's the kind of most basic point. But let me back up for a minute. So incarceration obviously is not easy for anybody, but isolation and inflexibility can be especially challenging for people with disabilities because their needs are so very varied. And because oftentimes when institutions and institutional rules are being designed, they're not being designed even thinking about all those varied needs. So this is a gap, and it's a gap that is growing in its importance. So I don't know anything about the statistics in England or in Canada, but I can tell you that in US prisons, it's about 2, maybe a little bit more at this point. These data are a few years old, and the population is aging. And so it's likely that this is a little bit understating. But about twice as many people behind bars in state and federal prisons report a hearing disability as outside. So the level is about twice as many people in prison as outside have a hearing disability, and about 3 times as many have a vision disability compared to outside. Once you control for sex and age and so on. So what that means is that the need to manage humanely what happens to people with those disabilities is a really, really urgent need. Okay, so what is needed? And again, I've promised a kind of pan-disability approach, and so that's the one that I'm going to take. But we need a few different things. Number one, we need a really clear understanding that discrimination is not always caused by hatred or dislike or a problem with the folks who are being discriminated against, but that discrimination has a bunch of a bunch of flavors that come from misunderstanding and under regard. So we need a really clear set of norms that say that it is not okay to exclude people with disabilities from the programs, services, and activities of an incarcerative institution. So, and even if the reason feels like it's a beneficent reason. So, for example, there shouldn't be a rule that says that people who are deaf can't have a particular kind of job, or that people who are blind can't have a job, or that that people who are blind, for example, need to live in the infirmary. People who are blind, after all, they're not sick. They're not in need of medical treatment. They're in need of accommodation and appropriate facilitation. And so putting them in an infirmary, which is something that's not uncommon in prisons, means that they get deprived of many of the things that make prison life a little bit less damaging. And so we really just can't do that. Even if the justification sounds in care, it's not okay to do that kind of gross generalization. Instead, if there's going to be a rule like that, it needs to be individuated based on the best evidence and based on evidence about a particular person. If a particular blind person needs to be in the infirmary, well, then maybe they do. But we shouldn't have a rule that says if you're blind, you're in the infirmary, and so on. So that's one overarching norm that we need to be thinking about. And I should say that I know that most of the folks here are Canadian, but that norm that I just talked about is a norm that is part of American civil rights law, not always followed, but part of American civil rights law in the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Rehabilitation Act, which is a 70s statute. So that's one idea, but there's actually a broader set of ideas as well, which is that it's also discriminatory and inappropriate to apply a universally applicable rule that has a very different impact on people with disabilities, including specific people with disabilities, than it does on other folks. So, for example, and we've heard about this already today, sometimes prisons punish prisoners for failing to obey spoken or posted rules. In my view, that happens too often. But I'm not quarreling with that as a general matter. If you're going to have prisons, then prisoners should obey the rules. Okay, that's fair. But what if the rule is posted on a sign that a person who's blind can't see? Or what if the rule is announced in an announcement that a person who's deaf can't hear? Then it's unfair, obviously, to punish somebody for disobeying that rule. So we have a rule that is a general rule, and we have to adjust it for prisoners with disabilities. This applies in other situations that maybe don't seem quite as exclusionary, quite as unfair as what I just said, but really I think they are. So, for example, there's a new tendency in American prisons, at least, to offer prisoners access to various kinds of electronic equipment. This is often overcharged, and it has its own kind of dysfunctions. But take this as given: prisoners are being given access to tablets from which they can get access to music, to sometimes to video calls, to email, and oftentimes those tablets do not have access for people who are blind. They don't have screen reader settings enabled. Nobody has worried about the accessibility of them. And that is a huge problem that denies the folks who are in prison, who are blind, access to the same level of programs, services, and activities that everybody else has. And that's discrimination. So one of the things that has to be done is to come up with a set of accommodation strategies that are routine and that are just considered as part of the process of running a jail or a prison. In addition, there are needs for particular concern for people with hearing or vision disabilities that relate to safety, because oftentimes they have some pretty grave safety concerns that we've just been hearing about, and those need to be planned for and accommodated. So if we think about all of this stuff, which I think is needed in order to promote equality for people who have hearing and vision impairments. And really, again, this is a pan-disability kind of a point. It's equality for people who have a large variety of disabilities. Getting all of this done, avoiding explicit discrimination, avoiding effective discrimination, coming up with strategies of effective communication, coming up with the kinds of strategies that are necessary for accommodation of various kinds. All of this done, getting all of this done requires that prisons shift their policy and practice and values and offer and think about choice and flexibility in a much, much more serious way than they typically do. And there's a reason for that. Individualization doesn't come very easily to prisons and jails. The rules in big institutions tend to be very inflexible. And officials in jails and prisons often emphasize that special treatment can provoke hard feelings and even pushback by other prisoners. But in my experience, and I've worked on these issues like our other panelists for quite a long time, inflexibility is often an automatic rather than a thoughtful response. And so we really need to insist as a polity that jails and prisons think much harder about where they can be flexible, where they can be accommodationist. So I know that we're trying to leave some room for questions, and I feel like I'm getting close to over my time, although somebody will tell me if I'm wrong about that. But so let me not belabor this point. But what thinking about accommodation really requires is thinking about flexibility in the event, but it also means building the capacity for flexibility before the event. So it's really important. It's really important that a prison, for example, jails too, but that prisons contemplate all the kinds of people who might be incarcerated in their facility before those people are, that they build capacity and plan so that when folks arrive, they're ready to offer them what they need to have equal access. So they have to adopt policies in advance. They have to prepare in advance for wide variation in terms of what it is that people need. They need to appoint people who can be disability coordinators, who can gain the expertise needed in advance and then use that expertise. They need to set up interactions with community organizations and resources, community-based service providers, training centers, centers for independent living, all of those kinds of things, so that they need to enter into the contracts they need for interpreters and auxiliary aides, for ophthalmology services and so on. All of that stuff, if you start to do it when the person who needs it arrives, you are going to fail. There's no way to do that stuff on the fly. It has to be done in advance. They need to train staff in advance. They need to create accessible versions of intake and orientation materials in advance. They need to purchase and install equipment in advance. You can't do a hearing loop when somebody arrives who needs a hearing loop. You have to set it up beforehand. You need to buy the telecom equipment that you need in advance. So all of those things need to be done in advance to set up so that when a person comes who has those kinds of needs, they can be those needs can be met. And in advance, the prison needs to commit to an accommodationist strategy that says we are going to figure out what people need to get equal access to our programs and services. And we are going to put in place interactive processes to understand what people need and provide them. And we are not going to take refuge in an argument that says, well, it's good enough for everybody else, it's good enough for you. That's not what people with disabilities need. And again, there's an insight from here that's even broader than disability justice, which is that it might be better, I think it would be better if prisons took that kind of accommodationist approach much more broadly for all kinds of people, whether they have disabilities or not. But we know that this is what's needed for disability equality and disability justice, and that without those kinds of plans and flexibility, that people with disabilities are going to not be treated in a way that is equal and not not experience prison as anything other than damaging and awful. And we owe them more. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Margo. That was very thought-provoking. And I really do like your approach on taking an individualized approach, looking at each person individually. I know at Correctional Service, I mean, that is quite a big focus, you know, looking at each person's individual needs and risk factors and coming up with the correctional program that addresses those needs. I'm very glad that you talk about the need to pre-plan. It's easier to do things from the beginning than try to tack things on later on. That's really important. I was very interested when you talked about tablets, because we had a webinar a couple of years ago about digital literacy and the need for people in prison and on parole to have more access to computers. We had a presenter from the Finnish Prison and Probation Service. They give tablets to their prisoners, and I do believe that they are accommodative of people with hearing and visual problems. Correctional Service is now embarking on its own digital strategy, and I will be very interested as an advisory committee member to see if the new equipment that they plan to purchase will accommodate people with hearing and visual visual impairments. We're going to turn to our question and answer session now, and you don't have to, there's one question that came to mind while you were speaking, and I'm just going to pose it, and you don't have to answer now, or if you want, you can. But it was, in your experience, do correctional systems treat accommodations as a legal box-ticking exercise rather than more of a rehabilitative necessity? And I thought that was sort of an interesting question. If you'd like to answer, sure, please.
I think that I don't really think it's so much that prisons treat accommodations as a box ticking exercise, is that they just reject it altogether when they're willing to engage the idea of accommodations. My experience is that they tend to actually really think about it. But what they often do is just say, no, we just can't do that. Like they just say no.
Thank you for that. Swayam, I will turn it to you. We have some of our own questions that we've highlighted, and we also have some questions from the audience. So we'll try to get a little bit from both, and we might go a touch over time, but if people need to leave, please feel free, because this will continue to record. So Swayam, I'll turn it to you for a few questions.
For sure. Thanks, Eddy. And thank you to all of our guest speakers. We heard a lot about, issues and challenges related to deaf-speaking folks in the deaf community. We're curious to know about folks who experience visual impairments. So how do visual impairments change their cognitive capacity or their load required to navigate prison routines, rules, social dynamics, and what can staff do to mitigate these challenges? So I'll open the floor to our guest speakers.
I think that when folks are low vision, I think when people are blind, it's pretty obvious how, I'm no expert on cognitive load, so I can't really speak to that, but it's pretty obvious that when people are blind, that prisons, which are environments which are, kind of large and relatively uncontrolled by the particular prisoner. So many of the strategies that people who are blind use to render themselves able to navigate in their environment are unavailable to them in prison. And that's very, very, very difficult. And the safety issues are also obvious. It might not be quite as obvious that low vision is also very troublesome in prison for a variety of reasons. Again, just because they're big, chaotic environments, and because the sound cues that are available to people in prison are very diffuse and themselves very chaotic. So again, a lot of the coping mechanisms that get used by people who have different kinds of impairments in situations where they have more control are unavailable to folks in prison.
And I know I've toured several prisons, and I do find that some parts of the institutions can be quite dark. So if you have a vision problem, and again, going back to safety, if you're unable to scan your environment and be aware of who's around you, that can contribute to that sense of fear.
Thanks, Margo. We did have one question in the chat, and I see that Margo did respond to it. So the question is, why is writing things down to communicate considered inappropriate? This seems to be a common practice in institutions. So Margo, I was just wondering if maybe you wanted to expand on that, and if anyone else is wanting to, pitch in. I see Tracey's got her hand up, so feel free.
Yeah, why don't Tracey knows far more about this than I do, I imagine.
All right, well, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting because most people don't understand that American Sign Language is an independent language, and other sign languages from specific countries are independent languages. So for example, American Sign Language is not immediately translatable into English or English into American Sign Language. Each of the languages have their own grammar, syntax, etc., and they have their own word order. So what happens is, I was going to talk about another person that I dealt with. He was a person that was going from the provincial criminal justice system to probation, a deaf fellow. And I went with him to the probation officer's office, and I said, I had called ahead of time to prepare in advance and said, of course, this person is deaf. He should have a sign language interpreter with him. The probation officer calmly refused. He acknowledged and said, yes, okay. But he didn't book a sign language interpreter. And I said, well, this is going to be difficult because how are the two of you going to communicate? And the probation officer immediately said, we'll just write back and forth. And I said, the languages are not the same. The word order is different between between sign languages specifically and spoken English. So the probation officer wrote in English to the deaf person. He looked at it, looked at me and signed and said, I don't understand. So I said, well, just do what you can. So the deaf person wrote in English back to the probation officer, and the probation officer said, I don't understand what he wrote. The languages are not immediately interchangeable. There is a form of sign language in any country where you can sign in Canada, where you can sign exact English, but that is not a true sign language. It is an adaptation. It's a hearing adaptation of a sign language. So that's the problem, is you have a deaf person who thinks in American Sign Language in word order, writing in English or writing in American Sign Language word order for an English person. And so the words aren't the same. The word order isn't the same. And what often happens is the hearing person reading the language makes a reflection on intelligence. And that is not in any way a reflection on intelligence, but rather communicating in a different language. So I hope that made some sense.
If I could just add something, for folks who are not culturally deaf, but who are audiologically deaf, you might think that the points that Tracey just made don't apply, but I actually think not the exact same points. It's not about word order and fluency, but oftentimes people who have low hearing are just not going to be able to manage to communicate in written English. Now, they might be able to, but they're often not going to be able to manage. So one of the things that I will often ask people when I'm talking to them who are low hearing is how well they do with captions. And it's fairly common when you ask somebody about if they can manage captions, caption television programs, captioned telephones. It's fairly common that they say, oh yeah, that's just too fast for me. Like I can't read that fast. And so when a prison thinks that they're communicating with somebody by captioning, say, the disciplinary intake, here's what all the rules are, and they think that by putting closed captions on it, that they've actually communicated with the folks in prison, the answer is they have not. It's not because those people speak a different language. Those are English speakers, but it's because the speed of necessary fluency in written English is just not all that common in prison.
Thank you, Tracey, and thank you, Margo. I'm just going to turn it over to our chat now. We have a question from Salma Ali. Salma states that she works with people with intellectual disabilities and ASD, autism spectrum disorder, in the UK, and is wondering, what is your experience of working with these populations, particularly ASD, who are deaf and who may have other sensory needs?
I won't say that's a population I work with, but myself and some colleagues are in the process of putting together a study, a research application to explore competencies for staff that work with folks that you have just described. So yeah, I just wanted to add that it's not an area that we understand well in Canada. Daniel, I think you had unmuted there.
Yeah, it's not a population that I think we've done work with, although anecdotally we were at a conference in the summer where I think someone was talking about some of the issues that people with particularly ASD face in relation to criminal justice, and there were some definite crossovers in terms of the things that we've seen in our work as well. So it's not a population that we have kind of worked directly with and done research with. But I don't think the issues are entirely distinct and different either. I'm not sure that's a particularly helpful reply.
No, that was very good. Swayam, I think you had a question from one of our committee members.
Yes, they did. Let me just pull that up here. So one of our committee members is wondering, are offenders who are not deaf or blind educated on how to support their peers? If so, what does that look like? So I guess how to support their incarcerated peers or their peers that are released into the community.
Just to say, in the context of England and Wales, no, that there is no sort of meaningful like education for fellow prisoners, for example, on how to support the needs of somebody that is deaf. And I suppose there is a question about whether there should be. I'm not sure whether it should be I think it should be maybe there's a question about whether the service should be set up in a way so it's more inclusive and accessible rather than putting the burden on other people that are significantly lacking autonomy and deprived and restricted and so on. But that's a slightly different point. But in the UK, no, there is nothing like that.
Yeah, I want to just say that I agree that sometimes prisons will say, well, the way that we'll manage this issue is we'll give prisoners with disabilities helpers. And because when prisoners have jobs, they are so very underpaid, that can be a very cheap way to do things. So a person who's blind, rather than being given access to the independent ability to read or write, might have access to a person who's a reader or a writer, a scribe for them. That doesn't tend to be a very good idea. It means that their private life is exposed to somebody in a way that can really be a problem. And really thinking about how to help people be how to give them what they need to navigate their needs independently tends to be a better solution. That said, there's a lot to be said for especially when people use sign language to communicate. You don't want them without anybody to talk to for the term of their incarceration. And so figuring out a way that they can have a communicative options is really important. But a lot of the things that might be called support might also be called dependence in a way that's really could be a problem.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Margo, because that was one of the questions we had, and we heard from a speaker at Correctional Service in the summer who talked about some people in prison who become overly dependent on staff or other people and almost become helpless. And then when staff try to encourage them to be more self-sufficient, they get quite upset because they've sort of fallen into this pattern. So it's a really interesting dynamic. And I was also thinking about what may happen if you have other prisoners helping those who are in a more vulnerable position, and can that open themselves up to instances of abuse or of some sort. So there's all these.
Yeah, I was really talking about that second concern much more than the first. I'm not really worried about people becoming I'm not really worried that people will do things that are bad for themselves, that they'll become too dependent and rely too much on other people. It's not quite that. It's that if they're forced to rely on other people and not given what they need to be independent, what that does is it sets them up for the possibility of predatory abuse.
And just to add to that, the concern, as I noted earlier, but the concern for me is, who are they buddied up with, or who are they partnered with? And who is determining or assessing whether that person is a good buddy for that particular deaf inmate? Who's assessing that? On what grounds are they assessing that? Who's assessing whether or not another inmate has appropriate sign language skills to be a support for a deaf person in prison? Who's assessing that? How does anyone know that that quote support person actually has the skills that they claim to have, particularly if there's no one that can kind of assess them? So one doesn't know actually what information is being translated, if it really and truly is, let alone the dependence on having someone be the interpreter of information. So there are many, many challenges with that. Mm-hmm.
Really ethical challenges as well.
Yes,
so
yeah.
In the context of England and Wales, there's been particular scenarios within my research where, like, I think we talked about it very briefly here, where other prisoners were being used as interpreters, and there was no way to verify whether what they were interpreting was accurate, and there was a lot of evidence to suggest that it probably wasn't. But that was in relation to discussing really, really important and often, sensitive things as well. And it's when we talk about like deprivation of autonomy and lack of power in prison and all that sort of thing, putting someone in that position where they are somebody's sort of vehicle to language and mouthpiece as such, probably not the right wording, but that gives that's very dangerous. It gives an unprecedented level of power. So yeah, it's a very, very tricky thing to navigate.
It is. Actually, the other piece to that is, as I mentioned in my slide, the thing called the deaf nod, where a deaf person will nod as though he or she is understanding what's been said, but they do that to avoid appearing ignorant of what was being said. So you never truly know, do they understand or do they not understand? And then if the deaf buddy or if the buddy doesn't have competence in using sign language, they can't actually check and see, what did you understand of what I just told you? Because their skill level is not at that level where they can do that. So the deaf nod creates a lot of problems for deaf and hard of hearing folks in prison.
I had another question here. If people cannot complete programming, forgive me, I live next to a fire station here. So if people cannot complete their programming due to hearing or visual impairments, should that count against them when they are up for applying for parole? And more broadly, are parole board, we don't have anyone here from the parole board, but are parole boards sensitive to these matters? Do they know that it is more difficult to complete these programs, and in some cases, for some people, impossible? And how do they deal with that?
In the context of, again, England and Wales, it is definitely, I wouldn't say necessarily held against them personally as such. It's not a personal thing, but in instances where it stops this lack of access to things that they need to do as such in order to show to a parole board that they're ready for release or they're no longer a risk, for example. Fundamentally, if they, depending on the type of sentence that they're serving, if they can't do those things, evidence from multiple studies in England would indicate that that keeps them in prison for longer, and often a lot longer. And we have had quite a lot of interaction with the parole board. There are certain members of the parole board in England and Wales that are sensitive. However, as an overall, I would say that there is not significant sensitivity to, right, well, what does this mean for their sentence? There may be sort of paying lip service to the issues or sort of tokenistic sensitivity, but I wouldn't say it would then help somebody to meaningfully address those sort of things that they would previously have access to. I don't know what it's like in Canada or America though.
Maybe Tracey has a comment.
Sure. Like I talked about, if someone does not have access to programming, traditionally, the folks that I've worked with and done research with, they simply don't get out of prison before their statutory release date because they haven't reduced their risk sufficiently to earn an early release. So that be a day parole or a full parole. So consequently, they stay in prison until their 2/3 date or statutory release date and released by law, because the law says if you're not released before 2/3 of your sentence, you're getting out, with exceptions, of course. So that is very real for them, is they're not able to reduce their risk and remain in custody longer.
Then in England, Wales, again, we have the flip side of, so we have different, I'm sure it's probably the same jurisdictionally, I'm sure there's equivalents, but we have determinate sentences where people will be released regardless of whether they've, been able to hit certain criteria, and indeterminate sentences without an end date where people will get stuck essentially. And the flip side is of it that if someone's serving a determinate sentence, they will then get booted out of prison without any adequate support in prison, and that then ironically their risk hasn't been addressed in any meaningful way. And as per some of the information on our side, it's the trauma that they accumulate in prison actually makes successful reintegration less likely. So yeah, it's not a process that's working well. Understatement of the year.
It's like these cold turkey release, and then they're not able to function out in the community, and then that increases the chance that they will end up back in prison and then experience even more of the trauma, and then you end up with this. We talked a lot about cycles during this presentation. I thank you so much to the speakers. I wanted to turn quickly to our area director, Dennis Herfst, who would like to offer a few comments about what changes we've been making at Correctional Service on these matters. So Dennis, I'll turn it over to you briefly, and then after that we will conclude our session.
Sure, thanks, Eddy. No, I just wanted to comment. I know a good portion of the webinar is focused on deaf culture, and we are making strides in CSC. Obviously, there's always more to be done, but certainly where we're at in Pacific region, we do have active contracts for American Sign Language interpreting, and they are being actively used as we speak several times a week by some inmates that are incarcerated, as well as individuals that are in the community. I don't know the exact count. We only have a handful of deaf offenders in our system in Pacific region right now. But CSC is making active strides with that. We do have an active contract in place. I know we've had 2 deaf offenders come through the Vancouver area in particular over the last couple of years, one of which we still have in our area now. The other has finished a sentence. And so I know firsthand we have used ASL interpreting for regular parole supervision meetings with the halfway house and in programs. So we're getting there. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. Another is that we're required to come up with what's called individualized accommodation plans, IAPs. And so those are supposed to be initiated in the institution and then updated for prior to and when an offender comes out on release in the community, basically outlining what measures are we putting in place to meet the needs of this individual and to accommodate them, to make sure there's clear communication and understanding, et cetera. And that can also include not just ASL interpreting, but physical devices, visual alerts, bed shakers, specialized doorbells, and alarm clocks and lights, et cetera. So that's one other component. And then lastly, I'll just mention just this year, in fact, we've had Vancouver Coastal Health, a specific deaf well-being program. A representative from there has been delivering deaf culture awareness training to our parole officers in Pacific region. So we're not there yet, but certainly I would say active strides are being made to meet the needs of this particular population. That's all.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Eddy.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Yes, and I sat in on one of those sessions and found it really really informative. So everyone, thank you very much. I would like to extend a very special thanks to our two interpreters. I hope for those who use the interpretation service that it worked well. We had some anxiety about it, but I think it worked well. We'd also like to thank some folks from CSC, including Rita Shandil, Nell Hales, Valerie Tiskevich, Sherry Jackson-Smith, April Dorian, Michelle Brooke and Jean-Paul Loriot for their support, and also for providing funding for our ASL interpretation service. We will upload a copy of this video once we've done post-editing, and we'll try to figure out how to do the interpretation window, or maybe we'll just do separate videos. We'll figure that out. And we will send out the slides and any other resources that this panelists would like to share. They can send to me, and then we'll just send out a package in a couple of weeks. And there are some other questions we had. We might just email them to the panelists, and they can answer at their leisure. And if there are any responses, we can share with the rest of you. Thank you all very much. I learned a lot. And I think this was a very good webinar, and I very much thank the speakers for giving us the gift of their time, because time is precious, and so we really appreciate that.
Eddy, can I chime in before we sign off as well? I just wanted to acknowledge you and Swayam for moderating today, and for our Metro West Citizen Advisory Committee for really taking the initiative with putting this together. Kudos to you guys. And also, I wanted to echo your thanks to our guest speakers. I know we're coming from different time zones around the world. Everybody's very busy. So on behalf of Correctional Service of Canada, we are extremely grateful and so thankful for our guest speakers for sharing your knowledge and insights today. We're most appreciative. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.